Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up is Friendly Fire, 1 mana 2/3 elemental for Shaman with Taunt, where at the end of your turn, deal 2 damage to adjacent minions. Down in the comments of this post, someone made a great comparison that it's basically Zombie Chow, but instead of healing the opponent's face, the drawback is that you aren't really able to develop a board. You can play Friendly Fire and contest the enemy board or deal damage to the enemy's face early on, but you won't be able to expand on your own board, or even use your hero power until the little elemental is silenced or more likely dies. It's always tough evaluating a strong statted 1-drop. You got your imps and clerics that have always been good, but this card has a unique drawback that might just not be worth it. It's great if you're going for a Shaman egg deck, something I've never really considered, but that's not really a viable deck. The whole point of a good 1-drop is to establish a strong early board. And so I don't think this would work well in an aggressive deck. If you can't follow up this great turn 1 with a turn 2 minion, then the first turn doesn't really matter. Tempo and board establishing is way too important. Now, Shaman doesn't have too many options at 1 or 2 mana for defense, so if aggressive decks are top tier like they are right now, then I could see a slower deck like Shudderwock use this by itself on board to counter early game aggro. Friendly Fire is a unique 1-drop design for Shaman, but the drawback might just be too much for it to see play. Next up is Capture Sphere, 2 mana priest spell that reads, choose a minion with 1 health, put it in your hand. Let's talk about the power level of this card. It lets you remove a minion from the board without activating death rattles, and it adds value to your hand, all for 2 mana. That's pretty crazy. Now you also have to talk about the requirement. It's pretty difficult to get a minion to exactly 1 health. You likely have to trade minions in, or use other spells to lower their health. Sometimes you might just have enough damage to leave a big minion at 1 health, and in this case the 2 mana is worth the cleanup and the extra value to your hand. But a lot of the time you'll be short of 1 health, or just have an easy trade out on the board. So having a specific health point needed for this to target a minion is very tedious. Shadow Word Death and Pain are simple and just work. This card would be great to combo in Paladin because they have spells that specifically get a minion to 1 health, but in Priest you don't really have a 2-card combo. Where this definitely could work is in Quest Priest. You wouldn't get the Death Rattle value, but you can bounce your Twilight Calls 1/1 Death Rattles to get closer to the quest, and gain even more value by playing Obsidian Statues back as 4/8s. It's cheap bounce back, maybe the deck plays it, maybe they don't really need it, but it works on friendly minions in this deck, which means you can run it and have a reliable target. If a play happens to line up against a big enemy minion that is left with 1 health, then that's even better. Capture Sphere is a super situational removal card, but it also works for bouncing death rattles for the quest. If a quest priest could use this on their own minions, then I think every so often they could find themselves in a situation where they could use this against an enemy minion and really strike it rich in terms of value. Next up is OneMan Army, 8 mana legendary warrior spell where at the start of the game, if your deck has no minions, your hero gains Wind Fury. So to build a deck around this card, you would have to resort to only using warrior spells, hero cards, and weapons. You get Wind Fury right away at the start of the game, and when you draw this card, you can also cast it to gain 15 armor. This deck would be insane, not necessarily in terms of value, but just because we've never really seen one like it. If you've ever made a deck with all of the weapons in warrior, then you know it's a bad deck, and that there are never enough turns to get through all of the weapons. Starting out the game with Wind Fury means you'll be able to get tons of value with twice the attack out of weapons every turn. You'll go through weapons so quickly, dealing tons of damage, and hopefully not hurting your own face too much. But taking damage isn't the only drawback of this deck. The non-minion requirement means this deck has no early game board development. Hunter's spell-only deck has secrets and spells made for the class that also summon minions. Warrior might actually be able to use their spellstone in this deck, and they have a decent amount of removal with spells and Wind Fury weapons. But there's no real way of establishing a board until maybe the late game. It's definitely a slow start for a deck based off of Wind Fury. And that's another interesting thing about OneMan Army. The cost is so high, and the reward is a bit of a mystery. We've never given a hero Wind Fury, let alone probably the best class for it, Warrior. It completely changes the power level of a ton of cards, but at the same time, the deck is also so fragile. What if the early game can't contain aggro? What if opponents run too much taunt? What if there isn't enough card draw, enough armor gain? I went to you guys with a poll asking what y'all thought about this card, and a majority said it wouldn't see play. But looking at the comments, some people mentioned how, regardless if it saw play or not, it didn't seem like a fun card, and they wouldn't want it added to the game. And I see what they mean. If this deck were playable, then basically just running a bunch of taunts or armor would easily counter it, and if opponents didn't run these, then they'd probably just get smacked in the face. While I love the creativity and the uniqueness of this card, I think it would spawn a non-interactive deck. I don't think it would be a competitive deck, but whenever it did see play, the gameplay wouldn't be great. I love the premise of using a ton of weapons and warrior with this card, but it's just not right yet. Maybe you could lessen the requirement a bit and allow minions that cost 3 or less, and in return, your hero could only attack enemy minions, or all enemy minions have taunt during your turn. If y'all have any ideas of how to rework this card to make the deck more interactive, let me know down below. Here's a quicker one, Snake Oil Vendor, 3 mana 3/4 for Rogue that adds a 0 mana spell to your hand that does nothing. It's a minion version of this other Snake Oil card from 8 months ago, just goes to show you how we all think alike sometimes. The spell that does nothing allows Rogue to gain value from cards like Auctioneer, Edwin, or combo cards. Really, Rogue can use a 0 mana spell for a bunch of things, and tagging it along with a 3 mana 3/4 just makes the card actually viable enough to include into a deck. It's a great way to make Snake Oil into a playable card, and it totally seems like it could be printed next expansion. Next up is Murloc Witch, 3 mana 2/3 neutral Murloc with the battle cry, summon a Wicked Cauldron. And a Wicked Cauldron is a dormant minion, so it doesn't actually have any stats, and it acts like the darkness out on the board. After a friendly Murloc, Beast, and Dragon die, it was specified in the comments that the Cauldron will transform or awaken into a Cauldron Elemental. The idea of playing a Murloc, Beast, and Dragon in your deck is based off of a weird group of cards. There's the Curator and these 2 other cards from the Karazhan expansion that buffed these specific minions. Now the problem with these buffing cards is that to get the most value from them, you needed to have all 3 types of minions out on the board at the same time. That's hard to do. On top of this, the reward wasn't really that great. Definitely not good enough to build a deck around these 3 tribes. Murloc Witch is definitely more encouraging. The Murloc tribe is already dealt with, so if you're playing a primarily beast deck, you can slip in a few decent mid-range dragons, or if you're playing a lot of dragons, which would introduce a lot more beasts, so you should be able to find a decent one to add to your deck. Requiring only 2 additional tribes is definitely manageable, but also the pacing of the card is much more convenient. Now you don't need the stars to align, miraculously draw 3 different tribes, and have them survive out on the board. You can play Murloc Witch, and then during the remainder of the game, you can space out when you play the dragon and beast based off of when you draw them and when it makes sense for your game plan. I don't see this as an aggro option, it's just way too slow. What you're giving up on initial stats when playing this is well made up for when you finally turn the Cauldron into a 7/7, so this is ideally for a slower tempo deck that has enough time to accomplish that. Murloc Witch is definitely a better and more interesting way to bring back this 3-tribe concept. With dragons and plenty of beasts in rotation right now, a card like this could present a class like Shaman or Hunter an interesting route to include more unique cards and to try to make tempo swings that can win them the game. Alright, last up we have something a little bit different. It's the 30th episode of the series. That's got to be at least 200 cards reviewed, so I thought I would present you with a design of my own. If you don't know, the r/customhearthstone subreddit has weekly design competitions where they give some sort of rule or requirement, people submit cards, winners are chosen, and sometimes people win prizes. Conveniently, last week was the 200th competition. Unfortunately, I didn't make my card in time, but I thought I would show you my idea. I kind of followed this week's rules, but since I wasn't actually submitting, I went a bit off the mark. Based off of the game and artwork from Slime Rancher, check it out, it's adorable. We have Slime Stack Party. 4 mana 1/2 neutral with the battle cry, summon 2 2/2 slimes. At the beginning of your next turn, combine all slimes into one and give it charge. So playing this card would give you 3 slimes on the board. Maybe on your turn you choose to buff one of your slimes, but on your opponent's turn, they end up killing one. Either way, at the start of your next turn, any slimes on your board combine their stats into one minion that can attack right away. Just to clarify, the combining of the slimes is part of the battle cry. So even if the initial 1-2 slime is killed, any slimes on your board will combine. And by any slimes, I mean any of them, even ones summoned by other cards. Combining only includes the stats, so any buffs or abilities that involve things besides stats, like a Spikeridge Steed, won't combine. Instead, it will either just disappear, or in the case of a death rattle, it will activate. So what's the design intent of this card? Well, first of all, 4 mana for 5-6 stats is pretty good. You may look towards a card like Giggling Inventor, and you may say it's 1 less mana for even more stats, but these slimes don't have Taunt, and more importantly, they don't have Divine Shield, so not only are these a lot less annoying to play against, but they're also a lot easier to kill. Just getting a 4 mana 5/6 would be better in almost every situation on defense than getting 3 minions with 2 health each. A cheap board clear or some low cost trades easily dwindles this card's value, so it's the distribution of the stats when initially played that is its downside and the reason you're allowed to get 5/6 stats for just 4 mana. A card like Force of Nature runs into this same problem. I think I've priced and statted it to where Slime Stack Party wouldn't work in any old aggro deck. You have to play to the weakness of this card, the initial wide board of distributed stats. It would be a great card for Druid board buffs. A wider board means more value from these buffs, and buffing the slimes also make them harder to kill. Afterwards, they would combine together for a nice bit of damage, maybe not great for Savage Roar, but it could still work. Another option is you could choose to use these extra stats for damage right away in Hunter by giving them Rush. Let me know what you think about the card. Honestly, I think it's a bit weak. Maybe you could give the 2/2 slimes Taunt, or maybe you could give them Death Rattle, summon a 1/1 slime. You'll have to let me know, but just remember, I am the greatest card designer ever, so good luck pointing out any flaws in this design. That is all for this week's cards. To find out where to create and post your own cards, info is in the description below. Thank you to all of the card creators for this episode and for all of your submissions. It's been a pleasure as always, and until next time, ta-ta.